Last week I got to sing with the band, doubling Chris Clausen singing the part of George Washington, who was musing with his young assistant about his farewell address. It was glorious. One of Washington's lines was the genesis for this sermon. He sang, "I want to talk about what I have learned, the hard-won wisdom I have earned." It's actually turned out to be a fairly ambitious goal, even for a book, much less for a sermon, so this will be a very selective list this morning, but here goes. I was ordained to the ministry on June the 1st, 1980, 37 years and 11 days ago. But in important ways, my ministry had started 4 years before, when I started telling the people around me that I was planning to go to seminary. I noticed right away they started treating me differently. And for my second semester in seminary, January of 1978, I was working in one of the many churches in the Boston area, Andover, Cambridge, Belmont. And here's what I learned in Cambridge: a miserable year in which I never felt like I connected to that congregation or its leaders, never figured out what they were doing in that historic old building on Harvard Square. Towards the end of the spring, I asked my supervising minister when the pledge drive would be. And he said, we don't do that. He said the executive committee comes up with the budget, compares it to expected outcomes from the endowment, and if it's not quite enough, they just pass the hat amongst themselves for the leftovers. Oh, I thought, that's what's wrong with this church. They have too much money. Every church I'd ever been a part of before had been strapped for money, but they'd also been alive in a way that this church didn't seem, at least to me, to be. Every church I've ever been part of since has been strapped for money, or as I now prefer to think of it, has a bigger vision that it can easily accomplish. It's better that way. I have to add that I've heard that the Cambridge church is now alive and thriving and full of vision that it didn't have in the 1970s, and that's a great thing for all of us. But now on to what I learned here from you in these last 29 years. And what years? It was hard work. Most of it was good work, sometimes perplexing, but usually in good company. There were some very hard times in which there was ill will, and which I knew I was marching towards a cliff of no return, where the only options were maybe good in the long run, but in the short run, painful and risky. In spite of the trust issues I talked about last week, some structural issues which we've now ironed out, I always felt the goodwill of the majority, and I guess I had it because here I still am, and feel fortunate not only to feel that I've been an effective leader of an institution that matters in the world, but to see signs of it all around. Membership growth, program depth, young ministers nurtured, talents coached, buildings built, leadership focused on mission and able to make clear decisions about appropriate directions. And while there is not enough money for us to easily accomplish our whole vision, we're better and better at funding our dreams and staying focused on what we can uniquely do. There were some pretty big tails wagging this little dog here a few years back, but no more. And during those 29 years, I had a baby, I raised a child, I learned to parent a young adult, a life stage I had not even realized existed. I've taken on care of my parents, one of those things that I did know happened, but never contemplated it happening to me. I went through a period of ill health, 4 surgeries in 5 years, and then a couple of seasons of pretty debilitating depression. Yikes. And that too was a learning experience, not only about life, but about ministry. The care I and my family got during those years from you, as if we were just regular members of the congregation in need, from the UUA, which sent a consultant to work with the congregation and help for me, as well as the counseling and coaching I got, they all taught me reams about ministry and myself and the universe. It was one of those put your face in your hands and cry till your tears run out times, and that's the most sincere prayer there is, and more often answered than you might think. That often frightening and very strenuous time turned out to be, well, not exactly a blessing, but at least somewhat redeemed. You don't get to choose to go through trials like that, but since they do happen, it's nice to know that good can come from them. It changed me, I know, for good. And that brings me to memorial services. My first congregation was a mostly young congregation. I did there 4 memorial services in the 8 years I served them. This congregation was more balanced demographically. Here I've done more than 200 memorial services and participated in or simply attended dozens more. Ministry is a business uncomfortably close to death for many people, and lots of people have asked me over the years if it's depressing. And some ministries are depressing. My colleagues, especially my Catholic colleagues who serve in gang-torn areas and regularly bury young people, violence victims, and violence perpetrators, I would find that depressing. In this more privileged community, we don't do so much of that. Therefore, I often find that the process of writing a eulogy and listening to eulogies others give to be downright inspiring. And that helps me get beyond the sadness of losing someone, often someone that I knew and cared about. It's actually a rare memorial service that I don't find myself wishing that I had known the deceased even better. I've mused some on this phenomenon of memorial services and how inspiring I find them, and it was David Brooks who put it into words. He wrote last year about the difference between the resume virtues, the virtues on our resume and the ones we're likely to tell others about when we want to get something done around the church, the ones that are most visible in our leaders, like knowledgeable, team player, and careful thinker, and the obituary virtues, which are the ones that are proclaimed in our obituaries, like patient, kind, and loving. And of course, we value patient, kind, and loving in our church leaders and our program providers, but it's such an interesting observation that the virtues that get us ahead in the world are not the ones that matter to the loved ones and friends who come to our memorial services and talk about our lives. This essay of David Brooks put into words something that I had noticed over and over again, which is when we talk about people in their memorial services, we talk about them in a more holistic and deep way, appreciating out loud virtues which sometimes we take for granted during their lives. Even when work colleagues speak at such events, they don't usually focus on technical matters or sales quotas. They focus on obituary virtues too, on how he treated everybody from the janitor to the president with a kind word, how she always was the one to remember birthdays or tell the joke that broke the tension, how basically kind he was. And as for family and friends, what they talk about, woven through tales of family vacations, marriages, and tragedies, is often resilience, courage, recovery, getting over relationship issues, and growth. I wrote about this in a Messenger column last spring, and I got more appreciative comments from you all than I've gotten in a long time about that particular piece of ministry. I think that this observation, so well put into words by Brooks, not only reminds us of what is really important to our lives, it is for me a prime source of hope as I age. Because my resume virtues are now probably as developed as they're going to be as I retire. But my obituary virtues, patience, courage in the face of adversity, and what is aging after all but one adversity after another? Kindness to those around me, acceptance of what is, I have the rest of my life to hone those. And the inspiration of so many of you and your predecessors is to spur me on at that. No, this part of ministry is not depressing at all. I like it so much, in fact, that I plan to start a small business helping unchurched families plan memorial services for their loved ones when I retire. And none of you are unchurched. I came here with the faith of a transcendentalist. With Emerson and others of that ilk, I believed in a higher power. Emerson called it the oversoul. But I didn't believe in any kind of personal care and concern from that entity. I had never experienced such a thing, called, in short form, God's love. And so, like that mandarin, I didn't believe in it. The great blessing of being raised a Unitarian is that one is encouraged, as Emerson also said, to trust in the integrity of one's own experience. But one unexpected, really very unexpected outcome of that time of ill health and professional difficulty I spoke of was several such experiences. They were brief, but profound, and I trusted them. Trusted them, and my ideas, therefore, about God had to morph into something more personal. Perhaps more important to you, since you in no way have to believe what I believe, I got very interested in the tools of spirituality, especially as they come from Buddhist and Christian traditions. Both traditions have a very long history of focus on the spiritual life. It's not necessary to believe anything in particular to use those tools they've developed. Some of you are a part of that intense focus on spirituality and spiritual practices that was so important to me. You may not think of that as a category of wisdom, but for me it was a critical part of the middle years of my ministry here. The readings, retreats, contact with interfaith clergy, and quiet time healed me and helped me to grow in faith. And although by that time we had quit our periodic descent into fussing and fighting, after 9/11 we suddenly have the challenges of growth. We brought in a second minister, and that is quite an adjustment for someone who's been a solo minister for 20 years. We grew from 500 to 600 members seemingly overnight, and suddenly we became a large church. And large churches are different. Not just bigger versions of small churches, but fundamentally different critters. I've spent the last 17 years understanding how different they are and figuring out how to be a large church minister. Learned a lot. Learned enough that I've been asked to be the Western Region's consultant for large churches on a part-time basis next year. But it was also hard work, and ironically, it was this focus on spirituality that got me through that work. And I'm convinced also that bringing a little more public face to our kind of diverse and open spirituality was one of the things that made us attractive and led to our growth. And in the meantime, my experiences of God's love got longer and longer ago and became a matter of memory and not present reality. It's very common, I read, but it was also very disappointing. And after some years of longing and experimenting, I found myself more attracted to the Tao Te Ching than to the Psalms. The Eastern worldview is very different from the Western, and those differences can be summed up conveniently by the symbol on our mural, the circle there, which is called the yin-yang or the Tai Chi. The yin-yang is actually just the figure in the circle, divided into usually the black and white sides. In our case, it's red and blue sides by the wave, the S form, with each side having a little dot of the opposite color. Reality in Eastern thought is created and maintained through the mutual dance of opposites, each of which contains some of the other, some of the white in the black, some of the black in the white. If the West had a similar symbol, it would probably be a square with a straight line dividing it into black and white, and there would be no splotches of the other color disturbing the pristine purity of each side. No siree. And also, the square would not be evenly divided. There's a lot more emphasis on strength than on gasp, balance with weakness in the West. That ideal of squarish purity explains a lot about our political situation right now, don't you think? But I have come to deeply respect the wisdom of the East on this matter. And the Tao Te Ching, its major scripture, has deeply informed my life and my ministry. For instance, here's some of my watchwords. Being and non-being create each other. Difficult and easy support each other. Long and short define each other. High and low depend on each other. Before and after follow each other. Therefore, the master acts without forcing things and teaches without saying things. Things arise and she lets them come. Things disappear and she lets them go. She has but doesn't possess, acts but doesn't expect. When her work is done, she forgets it, and that is why it lasts forever. The studies made me more patient. The part about teaching without words was a little hard for a preacher, but I got that to work too. And besides studying books, I started Tai Chi and then Kung Fu, which are the only real spiritual practices of Taoism left in the world. I've studied in 2 schools now, learned a lot, gotten stronger and more coordinated, though if I ever got in a fight, I would still be inclined to rely on my words, not my body, to get myself out of it. In practicing those martial arts, what I was most confronted with was the art of not being very good at something. You know, once you master your career and you don't have a 3-year-old or a 13-year-old around the house to show up your inadequacies, if you experience some success, you could retire early from life and quit being a learner, basking in your competencies. Before Tai Chi and Kung Fu, I had lost touch with an experience of my young self, being at the back of the class, the slow one, the one whose papers were always pockmarked with erasures, who sat at the end of the row in band and orchestra, last picked for teams, all that stuff. Oh my gosh, the bad memories. About the time that I started at Tai Chi and Kung Fu, I had mastered my trade well enough to be speaking all over the nation and sought out for advice, all that sort of thing. The minister of a church which had almost doubled in size in an era which most congregations of most faiths felt fortunate not to shrink into oblivion. That kind of success can actually limit one's willingness to try new things. And so Tai Chi and Kung Fu were an instructive struggle. And then there's the flow of the thing. This too is deeply embedded in the Eastern worldview, which at its most abstract posits that the basic unit of the world is not a thing like we have it in the West, but a movement, a process, a change. In Western philosophy, even in Western science, the basic unit of the world is something, a particle, an atom, a unit. That's why our mental picture of the ultimate in the West is God, the guy in the sky, an item, a person. Most people who believe in God believe in the guy. Most people who don't believe in God don't believe in the guy. See how embedded we are? And we talk incessantly about him, and the point of our Western religions is to tell us more about him, like, for instance, that he's a him. To understand the him part, return to that square, where the black part, the masculine, is carefully divided from the white, the feminine, and takes at least 3/4 of the space. It's fundamentally different in the East, which values light and dark and knows that each contain the other, posits that the basic unit of the universe not as a thing, but as a flow, a change, and calls that a mystery, and spends most of its energy not talking incessantly about that mystery, but rather on Kung Fu, the mastery of this life for the good of these people. So, you know, it looks like I'm going to have to write a book about the rest of it after all. That lessons and the wisdom. Turns out that there's not enough time here. Suffice it to say, these years have been so rich in so many ways, the difficult and the easy together, and I thank you.